Our rest of season wide receiver rankings will be led off with CeeDee Lamb. Now, honestly, tier one with Lamb, Chase, Jefferson, it is all up to you. Maybe this is too much of an instant reaction to the game where Lamb pretty much drops a 40 bomb against the Niners. Now, obviously, a lot of this is in garbage time, kind of busted plays where it maybe doesn't necessarily matter. But still, nonetheless, I know a lot of people were very disappointed with what they had from CeeDee Lamb up until this performance. I actually saw you on the live chat premiere in the video on Sunday night, just going through and saying, finally, I got a good game from CeeDee Lamb. Finally, I got a good game. Guys, I mean, I don't know. CeeDee Lamb sitting here with one game with fewer than 10 fantasy points this year. CeeDee Lamb so far this season, you've seen 10, 7, 7, 8, 9, 14, 17 targets. So CeeDee Lamb's out here averaging over 10 targets a game. He's already through his bye week, so you get the extra week here as well. Like, I wouldn't be surprised if Jamar Chase actually outscores CeeDee Lamb from a points per game perspective rest of season. But the thing with Chase in comparison to Lamb is, Chase, you still have the bye week in week 12, so you're just going to get the extra game from Lamb. And also with Chase, we've actually been a little bit fortunate with the touchdown rate so far, where Jamar Chase so far this season is actually sitting here with a total of about 7 touchdowns in the first 8 weeks, whereas with CeeDee Lamb, with the same amount of targets, is only sitting with 4 touchdowns. Now, going over to Jefferson, Jefferson hasn't seen the absolute blow-up game that we've had from Lamb or Chase, where obviously Chase back in week 5 gives you the 41-point performance against the Ravens. I mean, with Jefferson, you're looking at pretty much him being range bound between 15 and 25 fantasy points. Just, it's like clockwork. You know exactly what you are going to get. Super safe play. But regardless, I think it's just your personal preference between these top 3 names. A.J. Brown will be our next player in here at 4. With A.J. Brown, I know that maybe is a little bit disappointing this week where Jalen Hurts has all the rushing yards, but underlying this, A.J. Brown's still one of the most efficient receivers in the NFL. If you're going through and looking at his yards per target so far this season, you have 11.9 week 1, then obviously the injury in week 2. But then afterwards, you have 12.89, 17.8, and then this past week, 14 yards per target. I mean, A.J. Brown has just been incredibly efficient. Now, obviously, with that being said, you're not going to get the same type of volume as what you're going to have from the tier 1 players, which is why I will have A.J. Brown in tier 2, because I think it'll be a little bit more up and down. I would love to say Tyreek Hill is a tier 1 option. Obviously, Tyreek Hill was the top 3 wide receiver for us in our rankings coming into the season. If you look at the games with no Tua, I mean, they were a disaster, right? 7 points, 8 points, 13 points, and 2 points. With Tua, you've had 13 points and 26. I'm maybe a little bit disappointed with this Dolphins offense in terms of just seeing points funneled through the running back position rather than wide receiver. Maybe we're overreacting a bit. Maybe Tyreek is still a tier 1 receiver now that you have Tua back in and you're already through the bye week, but I'd just rather have the guys we've seen the production from all year. Amon-Ra St. Brown's already through his bye week. He's also in one of the best offenses in the league. The issue that you have with St. Brown is obviously there are a lot of teams in the NFL that want to just lean on the run, want to run the ball over and over and over again and play good defense. Well, this Lions team can actually do it. This Lions team can actually lean on the run and have Jared Goff just be one of the more efficient quarterbacks in the NFL, playing behind one of the best offensive lines, if not the best offensive line in the league, with the best running back duo in the league, and it's not even remotely close. So just the passing volume hasn't really been there in Detroit. Like looking at the target volume that you've had from St. Brown, he's taken up a high percentage of his team's targets, but at the same time, you've only had one game with more than 8 targets. That was back in week 2. So I think it's tough to say St. Brown's a tier 1 option still. Obviously, elite offense, will there be a ton of points scored? Like Malik Neighbors and Amon-Ra St. Brown are pretty much the exact opposite, right? Whereas if you're looking at Malik Neighbors, I mean, Malik Neighbors, before the concussion, was leading the NFL in targets, was leading the NFL in fantasy points scored. And a lot of people are making an argument to have Malik Neighbors up there ahead of Lamb, ahead of Chase, ahead of Jefferson. So I was a sell-high candidate for us back then because you could have pivoted over to Chase. With Neighbors, now the issue is a lot of people are understanding, oh, okay, yeah, the expectations are really bad in this offense. The one I want to point out, I mean, even for the game tonight, you can see the Underdog has Malik Neighbors with the 1.57x multiplier to score a touchdown. Underdog actually has the odds more likely for Pickens to score a TD than Malik Neighbors, which is just crazy to see. But you can go and cross-reference this with what sportsbooks are putting out. And sportsbooks currently have the Giants as the worst offense in the NFL this week. The Giants is a bottom 5 offense going into the future. And I think that is going to limit the upside, particularly for the touchdowns with Malik Neighbors. Now, one thing I'm pretty confident with Neighbors is he should at least have 1 receiving yard in the game tonight. And obviously, if you use code FLOCK over there on Underdog, you can take advantage of that free pick that we have more than less than half a total yard for Malik Neighbors. Doesn't matter if you use code FLOCK on Underdog Fantasy 2 years ago, 3 years ago, last year, yesterday, today, or tomorrow. As long as you use code FLOCK on Underdog, you're going to be getting that free Malik Neighbors pick more than less than half a total yard. If you're new to Underdog Fantasy, you're going to get an additional free pick as well, more than less than half a total yard for Russell Wilson in the game tonight, plus a 50% deposit bonus up to $1,000 and a free team review in the live stream that we're doing every single night as well. Just go through the link in the description or comment section. Now, Puka Nacua will be our next option. With Puka, he only played 57% of the snaps in week 8, and 57% of the snaps led to 18 points in one of the toughest matchups you could have asked for going up against the Minnesota Vikings. I had Puka ranked ahead of Cooper Kupp coming into the season. Now that we should expect Puka to continue to get ramped up and go to be much closer to a 90% snap rate player, I think that Puka looks to be a locked and loaded top 10 wide receiver rest of season. This is an extremely concentrated offense where there are literally only 3 players that are going to touch the ball with Puka, Kupp, and Kyren. So I think Puka is an easy lock here. Nico Collins will be our next option. So I'm recording this at the time of uncertainty around the Stephon Diggs injury. Right now, obviously, it being non-contact, everybody is saying that it's going to be an ACL. Assuming that Stephon Diggs is out rest of season, I think from a points per game perspective, Nico Collins will outscore Puka. He will outscore Neighbors. He could potentially outscore St. Brown, Tyreek, and A.J. Brown as well. I think you can make an argument to put Nico Collins up there as a tier 1 option because, I mean, you go back and look at what he did at the beginning of the season. 17, 27, 12, 33 points. And then the week that he gets injured, he literally only plays 13% of the snaps in this Texans offense, and he scored 16 fantasy points. Now that you potentially have no Stephon Diggs, Nico Collins could go nuclear. Nico Collins could be the wide receiver 1 in points per game rest of season. Now, the issue is you're definitely not going to have Nico Collins in week 9. Plus, Nico Collins has the week 14 bye. So I'm going to use the fact that you're going to get the 2 extra games for the majority of wide receivers in this tier that are already through their bye week and not on the injured reserve to put them ahead of Nico Collins. Because if you're currently 2-6 in your league, you have no business trading for Nico. Now, Drake London will be our next name. With London, it's a disappointing down performance in week 8 with only 6 targets, 4 receptions, 34 receiving yards, in an environment where obviously Cousins goes nuclear. But with that being said, I mean, London's been just extremely consistent. This is the first game since week 1 where London has actually had fewer than 10 fantasy points. If you're going through the previous 5 weeks of this or the previous 6 weeks of this, you actually had Drake London averaging close to 10 targets a game. I mean, so far he's a wide receiver 4 this season, just from a total points scored perspective. Obviously, he hasn't gone through the bye week yet. Obviously, he hasn't dealt with any injuries. But I think London's still a safe option. If you could buy him low, you do. Cooper Kupp will be our next name. I don't exactly know what to do here in terms of how you rank Kupp versus Puka. Obviously, we had Puka ahead of Kupp coming into the season. The second that Puka goes down, I assume Kupp's a top 5 wide receiver. Then Kupp goes down. I'm like, okay, well, you're going to get Kupp back sooner than you'll get Puka. So I would rather have had Kupp over Puka in that case. Then Puka comes back earlier than we were expecting. This past week, you actually see Puka, like we discussed, and what was supposed to be a smaller role, had the 9 targets and 106 receiving yards, where Kupp has the 8 targets for 51 receiving yards. So because this offense is so damn concentrated, I think you can say both wide receivers are wide receiver 1s rest of season. Just for me personally, I would prefer Puka over Kupp. Our next guy will be Deebo Samuel. So Deebo Samuel got a little bit banged up in the game on Sunday night. There's no official word on what we should expect with the timetable. Obviously, Deebo has a bunch of nagging stuff. He just had pneumonia. He was dealing with the wrist already. So it's a perfect bye week here in week 9 for Deebo to get fully right. If we knew that Deebo Samuel was 100% healthy and there was absolutely nothing you had to be concerned with, I think you could make a strong argument to put Deebo Samuel up in tier 2 with no Brandon Ayuk rest of season, where base expectations are this should be one of the best offenses in the league, and Deebo's going to have a massive role with no Ayuk. Now, we did just get official word with Christian Kirk that he is out for the season. So I think Brian Thomas Jr. is a borderline wide receiver 1 rest of the year. I mean, obviously, he's been by far and away the best rookie wide receiver this season outside of Malik Nabers. Right now, as a rookie wide receiver, he's currently 8th in the NFL in fantasy points scored. Now, he's been doing this primarily off of efficiency, but we've seen this time and time again. You can go back to A.J. Brown's rookie season, where rookies typically at wide receiver are going to dominate with the efficiency, and then maybe the efficiency dips in year 2 or later in the second half of the season, but the volume could actually trend up. Like, if you're going to go through and look at the snaps played, there have been a couple games over the past month where Brian Thomas Jr. hasn't even been hitting 70% of the snaps. But now that you have no Christian Kirk, I think that number goes up, where Brian Thomas Jr. is probably playing over 80% of the snaps most weeks, and we could start to see some weeks with double-digit targets. Now, in my mind, I was just kind of sitting here assuming that Garrett Wilson's been a complete dud in fantasy. And obviously, with Garrett Wilson, with Davante Adams coming over, you do have to lower expectations, plus the fact that this does appear to be a worse Jets offense than initially thought. But Wilson is currently the wide receiver 5 in fantasy points scored, which is a little bit surprising. But again, I mean, you can look at some of these outlier type performances earlier before Adams, where you're seeing the 23 targets in a game where they're just force feeding the ball to Wilson. That 23 target, 29 fantasy point games, just simply not going to be able to repeat with Davante Adams here, even if Wilson does look to be the locked and loaded wide receiver 1. Now, I know what people are going to have the most issue with, and what the comment section is going to be calling me a clown over, even though I'll say, hell, find someone with a better track record over a large sample. Our underdog teams are crushing it. We're 5-3 in the flock league. Show me someone with better results. But anyway, looking at this with Olave, I don't know how you can't view him as an every week starter going into the future once you get Derek Carr back in. Now that you have no Shaheed, the target volume just goes through the roof. His first week back from the concussion here, you actually see Olave go out with the 14 targets, the 8 receptions, the 107 receiving yards. Obviously, it's not like a monstrous performance from a points perspective where you don't get the touchdown, primarily because this is, again, a really bad offense with no Derek Carr. But with Derek Carr coming in, I personally would expect this to go from being maybe a bottom 3-ish offense in the NFL to all of a sudden maybe being a bottom 15-ish, maybe just being slightly below average. So I'm going to be raising my expectations with this offense. I think with no Shaheed, we've seen Olave's pretty much a guarantee to just have a ridiculous amount of target volume here. And again, like I said, I do think that the offense is a lot better with Carr coming back in. Now, going over to our next option, we're going to be looking at Marvin Harrison Jr. Harrison's been super boom bust. It definitely looks a lot better, obviously, this past week when you get the 300-yard passing performance from Kyler Murray. That was the first game like that from Kyler so far this season. Definitely very encouraging. But still, with that being said, Harrison has been operating as the deep threat in this Cardinals offense, where McBride's actually been seeing the volume underneath. You actually only have one game with double-digit targets so far this season for Harrison in Arizona. I do think that he can continue to expand his role, of course. Now, going over to Davante Adams, I think Adams can get better going into the future. Obviously, every week that you get a dud from Adams here as a Jet, you do lower your expectations, and you may just want to say, okay, well, the guy's 31. He could be washed. But I'm going to give Adams a slight benefit of the doubt just because, obviously, he did get traded to this team literally 2 weeks ago. DK Metcalf will be our next wide receiver here. If you're looking at Metcalf, a lot of this hinges on the receiver's injury. If you told me Metcalf was going to be good to go this week with zero hesitation, I think you can go ahead and you can move Metcalf ahead of Adams, Harrison, Olave. I think you could put him there at 15. But right now, I think you have a real risk for Metcalf to miss this week. Plus, you have the bye week coming up as well. So you potentially have no Metcalf for the next 2 weeks. So I would want a little bit of a discount here. Devonta Smith comes out. He absolutely crushes this week with the 20 fantasy points. I mean, going through and looking at what you've had from Smith so far this season, obviously the stinker against the Giants, but outside of that singular performance, Smith's pretty much been a lock to score 15 points every single week and give you an incredibly high floor in an offense that should be pretty damn good. Terry McLaurin's the wide receiver 12 so far this season from a total points perspective. Obviously, points per game, this is going to be much lower. But I mean, obviously, this is now an elite offense with Jaden Daniels taking off. Daniels should get healthier as the year goes on. With McLaurin, in comparison to some of these other guys, you do have the week 14 bye, so maybe you use that as a little bit of a tiebreaker here. But really, I think you can make an argument to move McLaurin as high as like wide receiver 13-ish. I think that I would draw the line at Deebo Samuel for him in particular. But again, I think he's a must-start wide receiver 2 every single week. Like, I think Jaden Reed's potentially a must-start wide receiver 2 every single week, outside of the instance in which you have no Jordan Love. Now, right now, Jaden Reed's wide receiver 7 this season from a total points scored perspective. Obviously, this has been very much up and down, where we have seen a couple games with 30 fantasy points. We've seen a couple of games with less than 10. Now, back-to-back games with less than 10. I mean, we've consistently talked about this all year, though, in that with this Packers offense, the fundamental issue is there are just so many players that are going to touch the ball that no one receiver is dominating target volume. Reed's not even playing the majority of the snaps here. I mean, Reed, you go through and you're looking at the guy playing anywhere from like 50 to 70% of the snaps in the games where Christian Watson and Romeo Doubs are both good to go. I would still prefer Reed, though, because I think you get the best boom bust upside. I'm going over to Jalen Waddle. Do I need to lower this guy down? Realistically speaking, I may have to. I have him in the flock league. I almost want to ignore the games with no Tua, right? If we ignore the games with no Tua, you're looking at 16 points, 8.5 points, then 8.5 points as well. But still, some of these other guys, like Smith, like McLaurin, aren't ever giving you those single point performances. So it is a tough spot in general. Looking at, say, Flowers, this is a receiver that's very similar to like Jaden Reed. You're getting these boom-bust games. You're looking at 3 games this season with 5 or fewer points. You're looking at 2 games this season with over 20 points. If the Ravens are going to be trailing, if the Ravens are going to lose the game, Zay Flowers is in a phenomenal start just because you're going to get a ton of passing volume here for Flowers. You can go through and look at the games where, I mean, you've really forced Lamar to throw the ball. Go back to week 5 against Cincy. Go back to week 2 against Las Vegas. Go back to week 1 against KC. And this past week against the Browns. And you're looking at 10, 11, 12 targets. But I mean, in some of these game environments like the Dallas Cowboys, Buffalo Bills games where they're able to run, you're only having 2 targets. I know against Tampa, you get the ankle injury, but he still played 71% of the snaps and he had 1 target and for a good 4 fantasy points in game environment in which Lamar Jackson had 5 passing touchdowns. Now, Mike Evans, this ranking comes with a massive asterisk. Like, if we were ranking these guys from a points per game perspective rest of season, I think you can make an argument to have Mike Evans all the way up in tier 2, especially with no Chris Godwin. But the thing is with Evans, you're going to have him missing weeks 9, 10, and 11 at the minimum. At least for what I'm reading right now. So you don't have Evans for the next 3 weeks. I think that makes him an asset that you're just not interested in at all. If you're 2-6, if you're 3-5, and you need to win games right this second. Now, obviously, if you're 7-1 and you can trade for Mike Evans at the price tag of a low-end wide receiver 2, you do it in an absolute heartbeat. Now, T. Higgins will be our next option. With Higgins, while fully healthy, I'm super pumped. You look at the last month, he's averaging 10 targets a game. But at the same time, this is just a continued trend of Higgins dealing with these lower body injuries. We've had it for years now. At the beginning of this season, you had him injuring his hamstring in practice. And now this past week, you have him injuring the quad. From what I've read, sounds like he could be potentially coming back this next week, but you are at risk for re-aggravation. And then going down to our next player, we're going to be looking at DJ Moore. I just don't see how we can get there with DJ Moore. Back-to-back games with fewer than 10 fantasy points. An offense that appears to have a very low floor, while yes, a high ceiling, but at the same time, you have Rome Odunze, you have Keenan Allen, you have Cole Kmet, all of whom are seeing target volume. So you're in a bad offense where targets are being spread out a considerable amount. But I do want to reiterate, the wide receivers between pretty much 15 and 26 are all very, very close. And I think you can make a strong argument to put them in whatever order that you want. So I know it may seem like, oh, having this guy at 15, having this guy at 26, that's way too large of a gap. They are close, okay? Dropping down to our next tier, we're going to be looking at Amari Cooper and George Pickens. With Amari, I want to give him the benefit of the doubt, but the thing is, the younger ascending receivers like Keon Coleman and Shakir are continuing to get better. Amari Cooper has just been horrendous this season. If you were looking at the efficiency, obviously the beginning of the year, we wanted to blame all of that on Deshaun Watson. But at this point, as we maybe don't get the consistent improvement here from Amari coming over to this Buffalo Bills offense, it gets to be a situation where you at some point have to see something. We can't continue to just give him the benefit of the doubt. George Pickens as our next name. You have one game with double-digit targets this year. But at the same time, obviously, there does appear to be more hope with Russell Wilson coming in, where there should be more passing volume than there was with Justin Fields. Now, going over to DeAndre Hopkins. With Hopkins, the efficiency has been absolutely garbage. Dealing with a significant injury coming into this season. Obviously, he does absolutely nothing against the Raiders, which friggin' sucks, because previously, like if you looked at our rankings last week, we had DeAndre Hopkins extremely low, but then the second that Ian Rappaport tells us he's going to play a ton of snaps, like, oh, okay, well, if Hopkins is going to play a ton, maybe we can start the dude. I got suckered into thinking that he was a viable start right before the game. Obviously, he does nothing. I mean, right now you have one game with double-digit fantasy points so far this season, but on paper, he's probably the wide receiver one for Mahomes rest of the way. Deontay Johnson will be our next guy. Looking at Deontay, I don't know how serious this is an injury. I don't know if this is a situation in which he's trying to force a trade out of Carolina, which is just so funny to think. Like, you're Deontay Johnson. You get traded out of Pittsburgh. You can see how Pittsburgh's playing right now. And you are now stuck in here with Bryce Young. Hopefully, you get a change of scenery. I mean, maybe getting him sent over to like Houston with the Stephon Diggs injury would make a ton of sense. Going over to Tank Dell. Tank Dell should have that expanded role. He's going to actually be higher in our weekly rankings this week, considering the fact that this week you'll have no Diggs and you'll have no Nico. But then afterwards, you're going to get Nico Collins coming back in. And it's not like Dell has been a must-start guy every single week. Dell's not at a single game this season with double-digit targets. And right now you're sitting with 4 games with fewer than 5 targets. Now, Ladd McConkey will be our next player. With Ladd, I have him in the Flock League. I'm really hoping that I can move him up the rankings continuously. Obviously, this past week, it's absurd. You get to 29 fantasy points. I feel like a clown for having the dude on our bench. He's already through his bye week as well, so you get the extra game in comparison to a lot of these other players. But with that being said, it's still an offense that wants to go through and run the ball, while at the same time, Ladd McConkey has given you 6 targets, 7 targets, 8 targets, 7 targets, 6 targets, 4 targets, 7 targets. I've had one game with more than 7 targets. There's just simply not a ton of passing volume to go around here in Los Angeles with this offense opting to run the ball as much as they can with Dobbins. Jackson Smith and Jigba will be our next option. JSN looks like he's for sure the dude over Tyler Lockett. I mean, Lockett, you had the opportunity this past week. He does nothing with it with no Metcalf. JSN is at the very top of the team with targets, receptions, receiving yards. I think he is the guy beside DK Metcalf rest of the way. We prefer the younger ascending receiver, of course, than the older declining option. Now, with that being said, I still definitely think that DK Metcalf is wide receiver 1 here. Dropping down to our next tier, I stand by. I think Xavier Worthy is a very interesting buy low candidate. It's now back-to-back weeks where you have 8 targets. You get the receiving touchdown this week. And I think going into the future, this Chiefs offense can be better than it was early in the season, where obviously early in the year you had more interceptions than passing touchdowns for Patrick Mahomes. but I don't know how realistic that is to expect to hold true rest of season. Darnell Mooney, in my mind, is always going to be these boom bust flex option, right? Where coming off the 31-point performance is easy to say like, oh, hey, go ahead and sell him high. Coming off a couple single-digit performances, it's easy to say, oh, okay, well, don't give up. He's still playing every single snap. Still has the same exact role he did before. You know what you're going to get with Mooney. Boom bust option, kind of relying on the volume that you have from Cousins. Cousins has a great day. Mooney's going to have a great day. I'm going over to Ridley. Ridley dominates with no Hopkins here. Crazy to see over the past 2 weeks before this game, you had a total of 17 targets to 3 receptions for Calvin Ridley. I don't know if I'd ever seen that in my entire life. Now you get the 15 targets to 10 receptions and the 143 receiving yards. He's going to get all the volume going into the future. I mean, what you're hoping for is you're hoping Levis comes in and this turns into, instead of the worst offense or one of the worst offenses in the league, just a below average offense. Now, our next option will be the pair of Bills with Keon and Shakir. Shakir sees the majority of the volume this past week. Shakir has himself the better day. I probably stand by the 21-year-old rookie in Keon as the guy that probably continues to expand his role. Ricky Pearsall will be our next option. With Sticky Ricky, I like that he was getting the manufactured touches kind of as a rusher with the jet sweeps this past week. My concern, of course, would be what happens if Juwan Jennings comes back after the bye. And then Romeo Doubs here. Doubs is definitely the wide receiver 2 that you want in Green Bay outside of Jaden Reed. The thing is, I don't know how to rank any of the Packers receivers right now as we are waiting for additional news with Jordan Love. Now, if Love seems like he's not going to be injured and this is just something he needed to brush off, then I think you could move Doubs dramatically up these ranks. But in any game environment where Love is injured or not playing, I don't think you can think about starting Doubs. But I really hope you got something from this. And of course, I do want to remind you, make sure you take advantage of that offer that we have over there on Underdog Fantasy. If you sign up with code FLOCK, you're going to get a 50% deposit bonus up to $1,000, plus that free Malik Neighbors pick, more than less than half a total yard for tonight. And on top of that, the free Russell Wilson pick, more than less than half a total yard for tonight. A free team review in the live stream that we're doing every single night as well. Just make sure that you set up an account on flockfantasy.com with the same email address as your account on Underdog Fantasy. That way I'm able to go ahead and credit you with that free team review voucher. But I think that's all I got for you. I really do appreciate you.